Baruch Hashem Yahweh. Amen. This is New Testament code number 1. This is a makeup session. We've had 2 of them before, both on our conference software online. This one is on Ubu for people that can't get on the conference center because they either don't have Adobe Flash or Java.
You are about to experience Jackson Snyder Presents, direct from the Vero Essene Yahad, a Hebrew Nation radio original program. JSP is a variety show seeking out Jewish and Christian origins, religion, theology, and history, and doing so in a fashion that is both educational and entertaining. Welcome to Jackson Snyder Presents.
I have a couple of terms that I need to get straight with you before we get going, because I use them over and over, and they're not conventional. One of those terms I use is Nazarene Acts. Nazarene Acts is comprised of what so-called scholars call the pseudo-clementine epitomes, pseudo-clementine recognitions and homilies. I call it the Nazarene Acts. I put together a compound version of the recognitions and the homilies, put them in a book, and translated out all the unnecessary words and Hebraicized them, re-Hebraicized the words. So it would be a more authentic read than the way it was translated earlier by scholars to sound like a medieval novel. What we find in this Clementine literature is Clement, who is mentioned in the scripture, who is the successor and secretary of Kepha, Peter, is writing a journal of the travels of Peter and his preaching, keeping close records of that as Peter travels from Jerusalem through Tripolis in Turkey and on up to Rome. So Clement keeps a journal of this. Clement is a man who's educated in Rome, a young man of means. Actually, he is a close relative of people that will become the imperial majesty in a few years, that is, the Flavian family. Clement's name is Titus Flavius Clemens. So he's related to the emperors Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian, 3 emperors that are all cousins of his. Later on, of course. So Clement meets Barnabas in Rome, is attached to his preaching, decides to become a convert. He actually travels to Israel, stops in Caesarea, and goes down to Jerusalem and meets the brother of Joshua, James, who is the head of the assemblies everywhere. And James sees him. He is an educated and fairly rich Gentile young man who is an inquirer, and he wants to do something in the movement. Of course, James recognizes through spiritual discernment and through Barnabas' word that this man has something to offer, so he gives him a job that I suppose James thought he would never get done anyway, and that is to travel along with Peter and take notes and send him a book of notes every year. So what happens then is Clement does go with Peter. He's unconverted for quite some time. He has to sit outside the disciples during the teaching. He can't eat with the disciples because he's unbaptized, and he finally becomes a full convert after a particular amount of time through the baptism of Peter. And then at the end of Peter's life, he becomes Peter's successor in Rome. If Peter was the so-called first pope, the first bishop of at least the Nazarene assembly in Rome, there were 2 there. Clement is listed on the Roman Catholic list of popes as on one list number 2 after Peter, on another list number 4 after a couple other guys that are important in our understanding of Paul that we do in the second session. Okay, we're going to get on Paul in the second session. Right now, we have some comparisons to make. The Nazarene Acts, now you know what it is. Clementine recognitions and homilies. Perhaps you're not familiar with this material. You can get a free copy of it right out there on Vero Yahad site on files, and a lot of other Facebook groups have it too. Go get it, and you can read it, or you can buy it by going to my shopping cart website at apostolia.us.
Well, let me correct that now. Go out to yahad.me and request the Nazarene Acts, and I, Bogdan Schruumkoff, will send it to you immediately in your email and give you instructions how to get the printed book if you like, or the audio book now. That is Yahad, Y-A-H-A-D.me.
So when I say Nazarene Acts, I'm referring to the Clementia literature. Second of all is the term Adia Bene. Adia Bene is a little country. We call it Kurdistan today. But in those days, it was, I don't know if you want to get on here, Mosier, or not. I just saw you pop up. So if you want to go on, you can go on. But I'm really enjoying that picture of you and your base there. So Adia Bene is a little country. They called it Babylon in the old days. It was up in the region of Kurdistan, northern Iraq, and on the border of Armenia. And why this tiny little country is so important is that Yahshua, Jesus, and the king of Adia Bene, Abgar, they corresponded. Yes, Yahshua wrote a little something that wasn't destroyed, letters back and forth to Abgar the king, who was sick. Abgar wrote to him in Judea, asking him to come up and heal him. He was sick unto death. Yahshua wrote back to him and said, I can't come up now, I'm busy, but I will send a disciple up there to heal you. And so Yahshua does send a disciple up there. The disciple's name was Thaddeus. Thaddeus is the same guy as his brother Jude, Yehuda. If you take Yehuda and Thaddeus and put them together, you get Thuda. And Yahshua's brother has many names. We get into that in the event called nicknames, surnames, aliases, etc. Suffice it to say, Jude goes up there under the name of Thaddeus and heals the king, and the king turns the entire country over to the Nazarenes. I hear some noise. Is that you, bro? Okay. Hold on. The king, hi Cody. How's it going, bro? Hope you can hear me. It's King Abgar, turn your mic off. Save bandwidth. If you got something to say, you can get on there. You can interrupt anytime. Look, the king turned the entire country over to the Nazarenes. He told Yahshua, I have a small kingdom, but there's room for you and I. So it became a sanctuary city for the Nazarenes and Ebionites. And when there was an exile or when there was persecution, they went up to this place they called Babylon. But the actual name for the place is Adia Bene. And I mentioned it a number of times here. I just want you to know where it is, and it's a ways off. If you go from Jerusalem to Damascus and you just keep going straight in that line, you'll end up in Edessa, which was the capital city of Adia Bene. And in the old days, that's where the Nazarenes hung out, because they were safe there, and it was what historians today call a Jewish Christian nation. What do you think of that? 2 terms. All right, now we'll go on to the content. There is an engine of power that drives the New Testament. And that engine is actually found in Galatians chapter 2. It is the power from the friction between the circumcision and the uncircumcision. The friction between Yaakov HaZadik, James the Just, and Paul the Apostle. Their conflict in doctrine. Their conflict over the matter of circumcision. Their conflict over the Torah. And then in Antioch, their conflict over table fellowship with Gentiles. By the way, Antioch, there are 5 Antiochs there. Usually when we study the Bible, it gives us Antioch in Syria where they were all at, but that's not where they were. Antioch on the Orontes River is where we are at. It's also called in Eisenman's book, Antioch on the Kaliroa, and it's in Adia Bene. It's not the one in Syria or the one in Israel. It's up there in the country where all the Nazarenes and Ebionites are safe. So when we think of Antioch, we've got to think east and north of where we have been thinking. So this is the driving force of the friction and the heat in the whole New Testament. You know, the New Testament is a kind of a diatribe or a dialectic. On one hand, we have one testament that is, I guess I call it a Hebrew or Jewish testament. And on the other hand, we have a Greek or Roman or Gentile testament. And it's amazing to me that Christians can't see this dialectic that's going on, this friction that's going on there. They're able to somehow in their mind reconcile the extreme differences between the two sides. And if experience in church is anything like mine, outside of the churches I pastored, all you're going to get there from a preacher is Paul. That's all you're going to get. You're not going to get the Hebraic side of that, and that's one of the reasons most of us are out of church today. There's also another friction that we find in the Nazarene Acts of the Apostles, which I got to tell you, is probably more authentic than Luke's Acts. Luke's Acts, frankly, I hate to say this, but I've come to the conclusion that Luke is one of the biggest fabricators and liars that ever lived, and also one of the most influential people that ever lived. Look, I'm not calling Luke bad. I'm not calling his scriptures bad. There's a lot of value there. But I have found out in my studies that Luke went far and above what he said he was going to do with Theophilus, and I think he's pulling the wool over Theophilus's eyes rather than trying to give him an accurate account of what went on in that time. Because the other account we have, as I mentioned, is the Nazarene Acts, and it's a completely Hebraic account that flies in the face of what is written there in our scriptures that our Roman Catholic friends have bequeathed to us. But in the Nazarene Acts, the friction there is a physical conflict between James and Paul. And in that conflict, you probably know, but James is teaching on the temple steps, and Paul brings a gang of no-good doers to that meeting and starts beating the students there. And Paul personally takes James, lambasts him, and casts him down the steps of the temple, breaking his legs, causing a riot and an exodus of believers out of Jerusalem. But I'm going to read that story to you here in a minute. I just want you to get the idea of the conflict there. So we're going to take stories from different accounts, or I should say from the Acts as one account, and then a different account, and compare and contrast those stories to try to, as John Lennon said, give me some truth in the whole thing. So Acts is composed of radically different stories than the Nazarene Acts, and it seems to depend on the writings of Josephus. Josephus, of course, was the general historian, the one who collaborated with the Romans. He had no other choice but to do that. But because of that, he was exiled from Israel for the rest of his life to Rome. They're living as an adopted son of the Emperor Vespasian, and they're writing two major works, the Jewish War, where we learn what Revelation is all about. The book of Revelation is Josephus' Jewish War, only in spiritual terms. And he also wrote, years later, a book called The Antiquities of the Jews, the history of the Jews from the time of Adam and Eve up to his own time. Now, the Josephus book, The Jewish War, came out in the 70s AD, but the Antiquities came out in the 90s. It's the Antiquities primarily we're going to deal with here, because it becomes very obvious when you read the Antiquities along with Acts and Luke, that Luke mightily used the Antiquities to make up his stories. If Luke did that, then Luke Acts can't be any earlier than the Antiquities, which came out in the early 90s. So we're talking about Luke being written, turn your mic off, Luke being written, 60 years after the actual events, at least 60 years, because of the dependence upon Josephus. Now we go to the stories. I'm trying to go fast because we got another one here in an hour. You know the story of Stephen in chapter 6 and 7 of Acts. I don't need to read that to you. Just recall that. The idea of Stephen, the righteous man, who was a tzaddik, a holy man, preaching the messianic truth there, and we find the Pharisees and the scribes and the people of the temple crowd getting more and more upset with him and finally deciding to stone him. And Stephen is there stoned to death. And we see an antagonism there between the Messianic faith and the establishment faith. Stephen is stoned, and that sets off an exodus of believers out of Judea to another place. All right, we have a story in the Nazarene Acts that we want to compare with that, and I want to read it to you, since you're probably not familiar with this text. So this is from Nazarene Acts, chapter 1. And it's book 1, chapter 70. There we go. I'll read it fast. And when matters were at that point that they should come and be immersed, some one of our enemies, entering the Hekel, the temple, with a few men, began to cry out and say, "What mean you, O men of Israel? Why are you so easily hurried on? Why are you led headlong by most miserable men who are deceived by Shimon, a magician?" Speaking of Simon Magus. Okay, you've got to understand who is saying this and stirring up rebellion against James and his crew there. While he was thus speaking and adding more to the same effect, and while Yaakov the Mevaker, that's James the overseer of the assembly, was refuting him, he began to excite the people and to raise a tumult, so that the people might not be able to hear what was said. Therefore he began to drive all into confusion and shouting, and to undo what had been arranged with much labor, and at the same time to reproach the Kohanim, and to enrage them with revilings and abuse, and like a madman to excite everyone to murder, saying, "What do you? Why do you hesitate, O sluggish, inert? Why do we not lay hands upon them and pull these fellows to pieces?" When he had said this, he first, seizing a strong brand from the altar, set the example of smiting. Then others also, seeing him, were carried away with like readiness. Then ensued a tumult on either side, of the beaten and the beating. Much blood is shed. There is a confused fight, in the midst of which that enemy attacked Yaakov, and threw him headlong from the top of the steps. And supposing him to be dead, he cared not to inflict further violence upon him. All right? This attack of this enemy was authorized, it says, by Caiaphas, the high priest, and resulted in the mass exodus of Nazarenes and Ebionites from Jerusalem to Jericho. That happens in the next chapter. Then before daylight, we went down to Jericho, to the number of 5,000 men. Then after 3 days, one of the brothers came to us from Gamaliel, whom we mentioned before, bringing to us secret tidings that the enemy had received a commission from Caiaphas, the Kohen Hagadol, that he should arrest all who believed in Yahshua. All right, so look, this fellow gets papers from Caiaphas, the high priest, to go after these Nazarenes. Okay, so then it tells us that he follows them on the Damascus road, and then all of a sudden the enemy becomes apparent. That enemy that is written about here by Clement in his journal is Paul, to be known as the Apostle Paul. So we see that in an early time, we accept this as a historical fact. It's called in scholarly lingo, the Anabathmoi Yacobi, the ascent, or they should call it the descent of James, since he's thrown down the steps. What happens to him is his legs are broken, and they have to escort him off and get him out of there, and they do. So what they end up doing is they go to Jericho, and they stay away for a while, laying low, while Saul, goes off towards Damascus with his papers from the high priest Caiaphas. Now we're going to go to Josephus for something similar. And this is in the Antiquities, and this is the story of a very similar riot. This riot happens right after Josephus tells us about the martyrdom of James the Just. You might remember James the Just, being the brother of Yahshua, was the head of the assemblies for the entire world in Jerusalem, and that the temple crowd, scribes and Pharisees and Sadducees, set him up and got him to testify on the parapet of the temple, not on the pinnacle, on the parapet. And when he didn't testify in accordance to their wishes, they threw him off, and the fall was 30 to 40 feet. He hit the ground, he lived, they called for his stoning, and they began to stone him, and then a dry cleaner came up with a club and dispatched James. And it tells us that James was interred right there where he died, and so he spent some time right there by the temple, at least his bones did. So that was the end of James. Now, when Josephus tells us about this, right after he tells us of James' death, this historian, he adds this story, Antiquities 20, 9 and 4. And now, Yahshua, the son of Gamaliel, became the successor to Yahshua, the son of Domnius, to the high priesthood. So Herod's made the change in high priests here. Two guys, both with the name Joshua. One was the son of Gamaliel. He's in. Remember, Gamaliel, according to Nazarene Acts, is a secret believer. And the other guy, Yeshua, the son of Damnius, who was one of the regular temple crowd, is not. He's out. Which the king had taken from one the other, on which account a sedition arose between the high priests with regard to one another, for they got together bodies of the boldest sort of people, and frequently came from reproaches to throwing of stones at each other. But Ananias, he's a priest with a lot of money. Don't forget we got an Ananias that Paul went to in Damascus. We also have an Ananias that fell dead on account of the Holy Spirit. And we'll also learn of another Ananias, maybe they're all the same, that went to Adiabene to preach. Okay? So Ananias was too hard for the rest by his riches, which enabled him to gain those that were most ready to receive. Now we're going to talk about two people you know. Costobarus also, and Saulus did themselves get together a multitude of wicked wretches, and this because they were of the royal family. Okay, I am purporting that Josephus is talking about Paul and his brother, Costobarus, which if you do the nicknames, surnames, aliases thing and turn it around, you've got Bar Kokhba, son of the star. You've also got something very close to Barnaba. Barnaba, was that ever his name? Son of encouragement? That's not what Naba means. So we've got Costobarus and Saulus stirring up the crowd, did themselves get together a multitude of wicked wretches, and this because, listen, they are of the royal family, and so they obtained favor among them because of their kindred to Agrippa, but still they used violence with the people. Their kindred to Agrippa. What I'm going to show in section 2 is that Paul himself is a first cousin of Agrippa. Paul is a Herodian. Hope you've read that in your book. I am filling in things that aren't in the book, you see. But still they used violence with the people and were very ready to plunder those that were weaker than themselves. So we've got an account there of another riot that Paul was involved in. Perhaps there is a certain copying here from Josephus to Luke to the Nazarene Acts in regards to a particular event that Paul was a part of that was very nasty and violent and did harm to the Nazareans and the poorer priests, that means the Essene priests, and particularly James the Just. All right. Now what does Stephen have to do with that? Okay, we got two stories here. In the story from the Nazarene Acts with James, we have James that is persecuted by a mob from the Pharisees and Sadducees, from Caiaphas. He has his leg broken, and he's later stoned. There is an exodus of all the Nazarenes to Jericho. He sends for Peter while he is still recovering from his leg wounds, and he sends Simon Peter on a mission. And so we have the comparison here. Stephen to James. Stephen stoned. James knocked down stones and is stoned. We have an exodus in the Acts. We have an exodus in the Nazarene Acts. The kicker here is the term that they used for the headship of the assembly, the mevaker. Stephanos, the name in Greek, means crown or diadem. James, of course, wore the crown or diadem of the prince or mevaker of the assembly. Not only that, but if you know your other early sources, you'll know that James later became an opposition high priest during the time of the rebellion of the 60s. And James is recorded in history as being elected by the people as an alternative to the unbelieving Sadducean priest. And James, because he followed a different calendar than the Sadducees and the Pharisees, following of course, the Zadokite calendar, because James was a Zadokite, proven in the genealogy. James enters into the Kadosh Kadoshim, the Holy of Holies, and prays for the sins of the Israelites on a Day of Atonement, on Yom Kippur, which was kept on a different day than the establishment or consensus priests. We find this in Epiphanius, in Eusebius, and in Hegesippus. And especially in Epiphanius, what does James have on his head as he enters the Holy of Holies? Of course, he has the Stephanos on his head. the Stephen on his head, the crown, the diadem of the high priest with Kadosh Yahweh inscribed on the front. What an incredible parallel here. The question is this a coincidence between these three different manuscripts? I don't know. Is the story of Stephen a gloss for the story of James? Another thing we need to mention is that there is an election there for somebody to replace Yehuda Ishkarioth in the pecking order of the disciples. And here is, on the alternate side, we've got James, who is given the succession, not Peter, who's the foundation for the assembly, according to Matthew 16, but James gets it by the laying on of hands, as attested in the Gospel of Thomas and several other early texts, of course, that didn't make it into the Scripture for a good reason, because James is just too Jewish. And the contention of Eisenman is that James and the family of Yahshua is simply written out or over in the New Testament, and that this story of Stephen is a gloss over the story of James and the temple steps, and the story of James' election, and the story of James' stoning. All right, I got to go on. What we do learn there is that James is the head of the assembly, nobody else. We find that in Acts 15 for sure. James makes the decisions. That the movement is being monitored by officials. And you know that the temple officials had their own army, and that Herod had an army too. That the movement was organized because they had a redoubt. It's an old Civil War term for a place to retreat to that was safe in case of trouble. In Nazarene Acts, it's Jericho. In the Acts of the Apostles, it's Damascus or Antioch. In history, it's Antioch. And so James is obviously written over here. Next, we're going to go to Acts versus Josephus with the story of Shimon Kifa in Acts 10 and 11. I hope to get 3 of these in, but I'm only going to get 2 in, it looks like. Shimon Kifa is found by an angel in Acts chapter 10. And he's given a vision. All of a sudden, a sheet comes down from heaven. It's got all kinds of unclean beasts in it. It's got snakes in it and roaches, pigs in it, maybe a porcupine or a platypus. I don't know. But he hears a voice from heaven 3 times. And that voice says, Peter, take and eat. Take and eat. He reacts to that by saying, Master, I have never consumed anything common or unclean. But he said, he hears, what I have made clean is clean indeed. Take and eat. All right. So we got that vision, and then he gets summons to go to the house of a centurion, Cornelius, supposedly, of the Italian band. I was trying to wonder exactly what that is. So, right. So he's an Italian soldier. In Judea, as you probably know, there weren't many Italian Romans that were there. The ones in Judea were mostly from Germany, Mauritania, Africa, and beyond the Euphrates River, mentioned in Revelation as the Euphrates being dammed. Why? Because all the Roman soldiers that were coming into Judea were from east of the Euphrates, and of course they had to dam it and bridge it to get them all over to Judea fast. Anyway, Cornelius is one of those strange Italian guys, the Italian band. Luke makes it very clear. He's a Roman. He's got kind of a Greek name, though. Cornelius means the horn man, the horn player. And his name is Cornelius, and he is a believer. He's helpful to the Jews. He's helpful to their synagogue. He gives money. He's a real good guy. They just love him, and I'm sure they have table fellowship with him all the time. But Peter is told to go on in and preach to them, and before he gets done, the Holy Spirit falls, and they begin to prophesy, and the whole family is then baptized, and Kepha comes out of Cornelius's place. He would never go into a Gentile's house because that wasn't done. They were unclean. Why were they unclean? Because the eating of unclean meats brings unclean demons in with it, in the meat. So they couldn't get near him. We learned that in the Nazarene Acts. Then he gets the interpretation of the sheep vision. And what is that? Well, these beasts in the sheet represent man. No man is unclean. No person is untouchable that Kifa ought to know now that he does not have to confine his evangelistic activities to the house of Israel, that now Yahshua's word has become invalidated, that he's only to go to the house of Israel. Now the heavenly voice comes, a Bath call comes down, saying, go out to the Gentiles, and Kifa somehow becomes the evangelist to the Gentiles. All right, there's the story in a nutshell. But when we get to the antiquities, we get something a little bit different, but something so close. There is in a passage, Josephus talks about a man named Simon, Shimon. This man named Simon is the head of an assembly in Jerusalem, says Josephus. And this Shimon is ever engaged, like John the Baptist, in calling out Herod Agrippa. Now, Herod Agrippa, we're talking about one of the later Herods. Herod Agrippa was the only good Herod there was. Herod Agrippa was a good man and a helpful man and very generous as long as he could stay out of debt, because he ran from debt for the most part of his life. But it just so happens that he was a childhood friend of a fellow named Gaius Caesar, that is, Caligula. And when Caligula became the emperor, he took care of his debts and made him the king of Palestine. That's the kind of friend I want to have. Of course, Caligula, as you know, was a maniac and a monster, but Agrippa got something good out of it, and Judea got something good too, because Agrippa was a decent guy. But Simon of the assembly was always calling him out, that his lifestyle was not according to Torah, and Agrippa, he made a public statement that he was a Torah observer, and that he ate clean, and he kept the laws of the Torah and the Jews, and by all witnesses he did. But what happens here, instead of Agrippa calling on his army to take care of Simon and go out and kill him, the rest of the Herods would have had him dead, like John the Baptist. What Agrippa does is calls him into his house. You heard me. He calls this Simon, the head of an assembly in Jerusalem, into his house to spend the day with him. He says to him, Simon, look at what's in my palace. Look what I do during the day. What do you see that's offensive to you? Eat with me. Spend time with me. And then go back and make your judgment to the people. So when Simon does this, and he goes, Agrippa loads him with gifts and help for his assembly. That's the story. Interesting about this, we've got a Simon there going into what's supposed to be a dirty Gentile king. Agrippa was not a Jew. He was an Idumean, an Arabian. He was the first cousin of Paul, the apostle. When we get to that part, I'll show you the genealogy that will prove to you that Paul was a very close relative of Agrippa and Antipas and a whole bunch of them. So we got those things in Josephus, and then in the same paragraph, I go out there and look at it, and I'm astounded because in that same paragraph there is mention of Cornelius Sabinus, who's not a centurion, he's a tribune. Next step up. And then, beside that, in the same paragraph about Agrippa and Simon, is Clement, a general. Don't forget, Clement was of the royal family in Rome. Clement was royal monarchical blood. And here, we find him in Josephus with the story of Simon and a Gentile with Cornelius and Clement all in the same paragraph. Incredible. I don't think that Eisenman got this in his book, but I went out and read it myself. So, what we find here in friction is the abrogation of dietary laws on one hand versus no men are common anymore. So, we get in our faith today, this has got a great deal to do with how people act in the Christian faith, in that they never see the interpretation of the sheep dream, nor do they know anything about this crazy parallel, and perhaps, do I dare say this? But our suspicion is Luke again uses Josephus as a source and makes up a nonsense story about the Italian band and the sheep coming down from heaven. Because when we look at the journal of Clement in the Nazarene Acts, the key fathers in there would never have anything to do with that. He is strictly kosher. And even Clement, his secretary, has to sit outside the circle during teaching, has to eat at a different place with different people until he fully comes in through baptism, laying on of hands, and the baptism of the Holy Spirit. Which one is right? Is the scripture that has been handed down by the Roman Catholic Church right? Or is it simply fictional stories? Or, on the other hand, is the Nazarene Acts that has been suppressed for 2,000 years and hidden away in a Vatican archive? Is it a lie? Which seems to be more plausible to you? Well, the outcome of the whole thing was that in Acts 12:3, Simon is arrested, but in real life, Agrippa dies, according to Josephus, and Herod of Chalcis, his brother, takes the reins of the government, and what does he do? He cleans up the Nazarenes, and he crucifies them all. Well, we got 10 minutes. I think the next one, does it start 10:30? I want to give you a break. I will have a little time just to get into the rest of this. There's really 2 more such vignettes. All right, I will quote one of my favorite teachers. Are you enjoying? Or am I just blowing off here? All right, I'm going to take it. Are you enjoying, Commander?
Absolutely.
Why aren't you bantering with me tonight as usual?
Because you're correct as usual. You're 99.9.7% correct all the time.
I hope you heard that because he always checks up on me, everything I do. The third vignette we find in the New Testament Code has to do with Phillipos and the Ethiopian eunuch. Let me see. I think that's in Acts 6. I'm not sure. I can't remember. No, not Acts 6. But it's somewhere in the New Testament, right? Phillipos, did you ever notice in Acts 6, while we're on the subject, that the apostles who appoint 7 table waiters, you ever check out their names? All right, I studied the passage one time, and I thought, boy, these names, Nicanor, Prochorus, Philip. I first thought, well, I know what Philip means because I got a brother named Philip. And besides, I studied Greek in school. So Phil means love, and hip means horse, and Philip means horse lover. I wonder what the rest of these words mean. So I translated, all those names translate into church offices. Prochorus, he's the chorus leader. Nicanor, overcomer, etc., etc. Now I wonder, we've got these Hebrew apostles. They're supposed to be in charge of the assembly. So why is it that all 7 of these guys have Greek names? Why are they all Hellenists? Can this be real? Wouldn't there be one Hebrew, Aramaic speaker in the bunch? You understand in Israel that the Jews were split between Aramaic speakers and Greek-speaking Jews. And there were more Greek-speaking Jews than there were Aramaics. And to think that the Jews didn't speak Greek as well as Aramaic is to be foolish. I mean, if the Chinese had conquered the United States 300 years ago, I imagine that you would have learned Chinese at least 200 years ago. It's the idea of the Greek language being the language of vulgarity and evil is ridiculous. A language is a language. It's only a tool. It's what you do with it that makes the difference. Some of these Hebrew roots teachers, they teach as though everything was written in Aramaic or Hebrew and that Israel was completely homogeneous, but it wasn't. Not only does Josephus talk about 4, then 7 sects, that's just in Israel alone. And some of those sects, like the Sadducees and the Pharisees, were primarily Hellenists, Greeks. The Jews out in the dispersion were of every denomination you can imagine, and every language you can imagine, too. What's the holy language? I don't know. I just get sick and tired of hearing that because that is ridiculous. Speaking of ridiculous, we've got the Ethiopian eunuch. It says that he's the treasurer for Candace, Queen of Ethiopia. Candace isn't a name. Kandake is what is there. And Kandake is the name of the title of the ruler. It's the Kandake. Okay, we could translate that queen. So we've got the Kandake of Ethiopia. Ethiopia from the earliest times was ruled primarily by women, as you know. She is, or the Ethiopian, who is the emissary of the Queen of Ethiopia, is converted by Philip on a road there after a lesson from Isaiah 53:7 and 8. I had Commander Lee tell me what was in that passage in Isaiah, and he told me, and I realized that that's the place where it talks about the lamb being sacrificed for sin. So the eunuch makes a confession. I believe Jesus Christ is the Son of God. No, X was not written in Hebrew originally. Impossible. I believe Jesus Christ is the Son of God. And there was nothing else. What keeps me from being baptized? There's a little water here, okay. We baptize him in a little water after that confession. Obviously, there's no circumcision, and then Philip disappears. I have some questions about that. My first question might be, what would the Queen of Ethiopia be having eunuchs for? Eunuchs are used to rule a harem of women for a king. She's going to have a harem? Give me a break. She had to have no harems. They didn't have harems in that day. Second of all, he's a eunuch, and the usual practice would be to circumcise somebody in the process of the conversion. But look, a eunuch is mutilated. And don't you remember what Paul said about circumcision? He said, I wish they would mutilate themselves. So we have this staged in such a way that there's a message behind this, besides the message of the gospel going out beyond just the Hebrews, to eunuchs, to women, to people way out there, to people in the sheep, etc. We have a secret message here that is reiterated by Paul numerous times, most appropriately in Philippians 3:2, where he talks about circumcision, and Galatians 5:12, where he talks about mutilating. Let them go mutilate themselves. All right? So circumcision is, in a way, tabooed by this story. Now, we leave the Acts behind for a minute, because we only got 2 minutes left. I don't know what time this next one is. 10:30, I hope? 10:30, okay. We have the story in Josephus of Adia Bene. Adia Bene, I told you about King Apgar. King Apgar had lots of wives, but his favorite wife was named Helena. If you know something about Jerusalem, you'll know that Queen Helena, that came from this hotbed of Nazarene faith, was, of course, welcomed, no matter what her faith was, to come to Jerusalem, because she spent loads of money. She built a palace there, for one thing. That palace is still standing today, by the way, Queen Helen's palace. She bought the golden menorah in the Kadosh. The same menorah that we find impressed over the Titus Arch. Where is that, in Rome? Yeah, Titus Tribute Arch there. We see the menorah being carried away to Rome. Queen Helena bought that. It was all gold. Think of the money. Queen Helena also used agents like Paul, for instance, to bring in food from outside of Israel to succor the nation in the famine during the reign of Claudius that's mentioned in Acts. That was 44 through 46. She was very well known and well liked and loved, but she was a Judeophile. She was called to the faith and wanted her family to come in. As I told you the story of Apgar. This had become a hotbed of Nazarenism over here in Kurdistan. But there was a problem, and that was she had these two sons, Izotes and Monobazus. Two sons. They were very much wanting to come in not only to Judaism, but they wanted to get over to Israel to join the Israeli army to fight the Romans. Adia Bene was a protectorate of Parthia, Rome's enemy. And Adia Bene and Armenia had gone back and forth from Rome to Parthia for a long time, and now they wanted to exact a little revenge, as well as they wanted to be defenders of their faith. They were Nazarene Ebionites. All right, Monobazus and Izotes. And I'm thinking that when Eisenman talks about, he repudiates, but when Eisenman talks about finding those two tombstones that whiten of themselves on the road to Jericho, mentioned in the Nazarene Acts, him finding them down there in order to verify the Nazarene Acts of the Apostles, I think they're Izotes and Monobazus, because they died on the battlefield fighting from Israel, from Adia Bene, against Cestius, the great Roman general, who got to the walls of Jerusalem and stopped and turned back for no reason at all, allowing the Nazarenes, Ebionites, and other believers to flee Jerusalem, as Joshua said they were to do, and flee to the caves of Pella, according to Eusebius. Okay, So these two brothers and their mother wanted to come in, but they didn't want to be circumcised. So we have the story of them meeting a missionary, and his name was Ananias, of course. Ananias of Damascus, I don't know. But it said that Ananias had a companion. So we find them over there, now evangelizing the queen and her two sons into a Judaism without circumcision. This is a story that comes out of the actual city archives of Edessa, the capital city of Adiabene, and was searched out by the historian Eusebius himself to see if it was true. He found him, he swears, in the city archives, and he gives us these letters himself in regards to this particular situation and the letters between Joshua and the king. He says these are for real. They were archived. All right. So they go over there and they convince them that they have no need for circumcision, that they can come into the fold of this kind of Nazarene faith. I told you there's a dialectic in the New Testament, the circumcision against the non-circumcision. Okay, now that story comes from Eusebius. Josephus has the story too. He's got it in a little different way. Josephus says the missionary is Lazarus, Eliezer. Lazarus and a companion. Who? I don't know. And he convinces them that circumcision is absolutely necessary to be a part of the faith, just like it says in Nazarene Acts. And what do? These men are so on fire for this and wanting to get to Israel so bad and practice their faith on the spot. They circumcise themselves. That according to Josephus. Now, what we see here is a parallel and a contrast between the Ethiopian eunuch and Isadas and Manabazas in Adiabene in regards to circumcision. We see a eunuch that's mutilated. Circumcision isn't even mentioned because Acts is Pauline. Acts is of that part of the dialectic that goes against the circumcision. And the point they're trying to make is the guy was already mutilated. On the other hand, we have the story of Josephus where these fellows mutilate themselves, according to Paul. Where did Luke get this story? There was no eunuchs then. No Kandake of Ethiopia at that time. Believe me, I'm not telling you my personal opinion. I'm talking Eisenman here. I've been reading him for a lot of years. It's really hard to explain. But when we play the name game, we have in these sections Ananias and Paul in Acts 9:9. Ananias and Abgar. Ananias and Peter. Ananias and Agabus. Sapphira, Zipporah, and Peter. We got Ananias and James. And Annas and Jesus. Name games. What is this all about? Somebody's trying to put something over on us. Back to Queen Helena really quick. I mentioned that she brought in relief, the gold menorah, and she has a palace in Jerusalem, but I didn't mention that King Abgar wrote to Joshua. Yes, I did. He had an Antioch. We did talk about that. He was converted along with all of the nation, and he made his nation a sanctuary for the Nazarenes. And look,